possible. Based upon the format that was agreed to prior to the debate, the person to whom the question is addressed will get up to 3 minutes to answer the question, and the participant to whom the question was not addressed will then get 1 minute to provide a rebuttal to the answer. For the questions that are addressed to both, we would ask that each participant take 2 minutes or so to answer the question. We'll move on. I've divided the questions into 3 piles, those for Dr. Stein, those for Reverend Shelby, and those addressed to both. And it's my intention to just rotate randomly through the stacks. I've mixed the stacks up until we hit 10:15. At such time, we will formally end the presentation, but both speakers said they would stay around to answer some one-on-one questions, but they will physically lock the doors to the building at 11 o'clock. So if you don't want to spend the night in the Kansas Student Union, we have to be out of here by 11. So the sooner we get started, the better. So the first question will be for Dr. Stein. And the question is, I'm an atheist, but not for your ethical reasons. Without a God, is not man, or specifically man's life, the standard in all moral values? If you say, how can you propose accepting both the Golden Rule and utilitarianism, which are contradictory, and your 2 formulations of the utilitarian principle were contradictory? So I guess, how do you, what's the standard for moral values?
Okay. Let's go back to the reason that we have moral values in the first place. It's the same reason we have societies, it's the same reason we have laws, namely survival of the human race and survival of yourself. If we had complete anarchy, chaos, and no laws at all, and it was perfectly okay to kill people, you would be killed as well as anyone else. If you could kill, you would be killed too. Society would degenerate and would wipe itself out. So when someone very wise, probably over thousands of years of society, on a more limited basis, caveman days, or whatever you want to call it, decided, hey, we've got to have some rules here, we're going to kill each other off. And so they started putting in laws and rules and raising their children, teaching them these rules. That's how we got the morality. Now, that has nothing to do with God. It doesn't have to have anything to do with God. It has to do with survival of the society. Now, on those 4 principles I said, I didn't say they weren't self-contradictory. I mean, contradictory to them, one with the other. Sometimes they are. You have to balance all 4 of them, and then put all 4 of them into the mix and come up with a solution that involves all 4 of them in the best way you can. You have to optimize each one of them, is what I'm saying. And of course, I don't think I made a contradictory 2 presentations of the utilitarian principle. I said it's the greatest good for the greatest number. That's the only time I defined it. And that doesn't necessarily agree with self-actualization. It doesn't necessarily agree with not hurting other people against their will. Sometimes that is part of the greatest good for the greatest number. You have to balance all 4 of those together. It's not easy, but it is possible, and that's all I said.
I think this particular question illustrates very well the bankruptcy of the atheist position, because you have 2 problems. Number one, they can't tell you where morals come from outside of themselves, as far as having an absolute standard. Now with science, as we mentioned, with science and logic, they will say there are rules, there's order, there are things that you cannot violate, but they will not admit that about morals. And so what they have to say is that morals are a result of human convention, and they are matter of stipulation. So the greatest good for the greatest number of people. But what that means is that within Hitler's Germany, if the greatest number of people decided it was right to kill the Jews, then they killed the Jews. Now you may say, well, yes, but within Western society, we don't agree with what Hitler's Germany did, therefore it was wrong. Well, it wasn't wrong at that time to those people who did it. And if you say that, well, in Western society, well, you know, we're in a logical bind here, where in some societies they welcome their neighbors, and in some societies they eat them. And both are equally right in an atheist system.
This question is addressed to Reverend Shelby. Even granted all your numbers proving a narrow band in which life can occur, how does evidence that the universe is, quote, finely tuned, unquote, presuppose a fine-tuner? All that it shows is that this is our universe, and it permitted us to come about.
Well, I think now we're back to admitting the scientific evidence, because you can't do anything other than that, and not dealing with, totally ignoring the logical evidence. Because neither Dr. Stein, nobody said tonight, okay, you went through these logical proofs and you gave these 8 logical pointers and it was all tightly reasoned together and nobody broke that chain and nobody, he basically set up arguments that I hadn't used to attack them. So logically, there has to be a cause for every effect. Now, if you don't want to go by logic and reason, then be an atheist, that's fine. But if you're going to go by logic and reason, you need to make it consistent over all areas of your life, including the spiritual and the religious area. And so if you're going to do that, then the reason why that all of the evidence in design points to a God is for the logical reasons that we started off with tonight. The design and the evidence is there. Therefore, that is among those natural pointers to God are valid, because they fit in logically with what we know must be true. What scientists, in order to get out of admitting they're a God, they come up with the anthropic principle, which I don't think was quite as Dr. Stein described it tonight, but they have a weak anthropic principle, they have a strong anthropic principle, they have a participatory anthropic principle. Now, I have my own, you have SAP, WAP, FAP. I have CRAP, which I think is probably most of these cosmological, reverberation anthropic principles are that bovine scatology that General Schwarzkopf talked about in one of his press briefings. Because you simply can't get out of it. You can't get out of it scientifically. You can't get out of it logically. You want to say, okay, the numbers are there, and they admit that there's this narrow band, but then you want to get out of saying that it couldn't have gotten here any other way. And you just can't do that with every other thing in life. Whether you're talking about bouncing a ball, well, somebody bounced it, somebody threw it. If you want to say a cyclic, many big bangs, and it's bouncing back and forth, well, somebody started it going. Somebody threw the ball in the first instance, at the first time. Somebody laid the cosmic egg, or somebody lit the fuse, and otherwise you're just not being logical, because nothing else in the universe happens that way, does it? Does anything else happen without a cause? I can't think of anything that happens without a cause. I tell you what, you show me how those logical principles are invalid, and then maybe you have a case for your position.
Well, I'm surprised here, because an atheist is the last person in the world who would say don't use logic and reason. If you don't use logic and reason, you'll be a theist, not an atheist. The atheist sticks to logic and reason. That's all we have to make decisions. And if logic and reason gives you a conclusion that you don't like, well, it's too damn bad. That's the way it works. And if you don't want to believe it, you want to believe it on faith, in spite of the fact that logic and reason take you to the opposite position, then you are a theist. The atheist doesn't have that problem. The atheist position is based on logic and reason. Now, secondly, I'm glad that I was surprised that he said I didn't address his arguments. I specifically answered every argument that he offered that was relevant at all, and I pointed out the ones that weren't relevant. So to make that charge is to define his position as he did, as CRAP.
Okay, the next question is addressed to both speakers, and we'd ask them to take 2 minutes apiece for this. What do you think about reincarnation? ? And we will start with Reverend Shelby.
I'd say that I think about reincarnation the same way I think about the cyclic theory of many big bangs. Life happening over and over again. I would call. Dr. Stein said I'm a lousy cosmologist, and I take that really hard. I would call his cosmology voodoo cosmology. And so I think reincarnation is kind of a voodoo life after death explanation. The problem is there's no evidence either from logic or from reason or from science that reincarnation is valid as an explanation for what happens to a person after death.
Well, we are in agreement here, in the sense that I think that logically we have a problem with reincarnation. Because are you saying that Is reincarnation saying that the personality of the previous person survives? If so, how does it survive when the body is dead? I mean, where is this personality? Is it hanging around in space without any physical atoms or anything else to it? It causes a real problem, logically and scientifically and factually, as to explaining this. Why should it come back in another person? So, I mean, I think you can't really make a case for reincarnation that holds up logically. I mean, it sounds great. Eternal life, it's another way of having eternal life in a way, but I don't think that the Christian explanation for eternal life is any better. It has the same problems. And you're coming back after you're dead in heaven or in some other place, the rapture or whatever you want to call it, depending on which particular theology you're subscribing to, is to me fraught with exactly the same problems as reincarnation is. And to say it isn't is to ignore the logical problems involved in it.
All right, the next question is addressed to Dr. Stein. Do you believe the existence of so many religions would not lend proof to the idea of the existence of some kind of supernatural being, i.e. a God? Otherwise, how could or would mankind have originally conceived of the idea?
Well, there's three different questions all wrapped up in here. Does the widespreadness of something attest to its truth? The answer is no. It attests to some kind of human need, perhaps, to believe in this idea. And I think it comes from the fact that we're kind of scared in this world. The world can overwhelm you, and there's a lot of unknown things, a lot of dangers. And it's nice to have kind of a protector, even if you make it up yourself. Your imaginary protector will keep you out of problems and make sure that you survive and that you reach happiness and everything will work out well in the end. It's a great idea. I applaud I mean, if this were an advertising campaign, the guy would get a huge bonus and become vice president of the firm. Because it's a great idea. It doesn't mean it's true. I test the truthfulness of something by the facts. And what are the facts? The facts do not support that position, even though it's a great, comfort-giving idea. And if people want to believe in that idea because it makes them happy, that's their right. I would never take that away from them. I just say, if we're going to examine the facts behind something, let's examine the facts and come to a conclusion based on the facts. If you want to continue to believe something or don't want to examine the facts and go in your own little corner, fine.
I think I would agree that the different religions proves that there is a God, but maybe for a different reason. If there is only one God, and if that God cares how He is worshipped, then what you have to say is that He cannot be the author of good and evil at the same time. Since there is evil in the universe, it stands to reason that there was an author of that separate from God. And that author of evil, since he is evil himself, both a murderer and a liar, because he exists, would counterfeit the things that God does. He would counterfeit the one true religion that God has. But now think about this. Just because there are so many concepts of God does not mean that there's not one true one, and it doesn't mean that you can't find it.
The next question is addressed to Reverend Shelby. What does God consist of?
There are about 8 different statements in the Bible that gives you some really good definitions. I think 2 of the key ones, because this hits really squarely at the atheist arguments. God is light, and God is love. God is light and God is love. God is light. Now, that's something that's even proven scientifically, because as Einstein goes through his equations for general relativity and is talking about how light stays constant, light is the constant no matter where you are at in relationship to objects which are moving. Everything else is measured against light. In terms of the observable universe and things that we can test scientifically, light is the constant. Everything else is measured against it. And so light is a good picture of God. I think that's one of the reasons why God says, or the Bible says, that God is light. Because again, God is that constant against which everything in the universe is also measured. So light is the constant against which everything is measured. God is light. God is also love. Because here's another area where you have no explanation. You have no explanation for these type of things apart from God. In other words, if you want to say that the only thing that you will admit the existence of are things that you can prove naturally, then you've eliminated the existence of what? Mind, ideas, thoughts, love, emotions. You have those are not things that you can learn about by putting them in a test tube, and yet we know that they exist. Man has a soul. We know that's the case. Dr. Stein might not accept that and agree with that, but we know that we've got a mind, we've got rationality, we've got thoughts, we've got emotions. In other words, without a God, how do you get a personality from only natural substances? How do you evolve the mind? How do you evolve a personality? Where did it come from? Now, I have an answer for that. An atheist worldview does not have an answer for that because there's no creator. And to say that it just evolved over time is, again, to beg the question unless you can show the mechanism scientifically by which that could evolve over time and by which that could happen. So love is another good one that hits, I think, right at the core of the issue where atheists are concerned because you have no explanation for those type of feelings and values in an atheist world system. So God is light and God is love, I think, are two key ones that I would say, as well as the Bible says God is spirit, and I addressed that at some length in my opening statement.
It's not correct to say that atheists have no explanation for these things. It isn't explainable in an atheist worldview. We don't have an answer that is detailed, but I have somewhat of an explanation. I certainly believe in love, I believe in mind, I believe in emotions. I think light is a valid concept. I don't have to call him God. I think it just complicates things. Why call it God when there's a perfectly good word light, and a perfectly good word love, and a perfectly good word mind? Now, what is mind? I think, and I give you sort of an analogy, when you hear a motor running, a motor is turned on, it's running, you hear a hum. What is the hum? If I take the entire motor apart, I will not find the hum. It is not a physical, it's not a thing that I can put in a bottle or in a can or a jar. Yet it is a symptom or a evidence that the motor is running. Mind is the thing that occurs when the brain is working. It's the symptom of the brain functioning in some way. It doesn't. I mean, you take the whole brain apart, you won't find mind. But that doesn't mean it isn't a valid concept. It's something that's useful, and that's why we have an explanation. I mean, that's my explanation. It's not a perfect explanation, but at least it doesn't fail as a total lack of an explanation.
The next question is addressed to both speakers. Isn't the patriarchy implicit in the theological position merely an indication of the social advantage for patriarchs? That is, don't the strong males get to make the rules and take the power, quote, capitalized, underlined, in his image, close quotes, question mark?
Who was that addressed to first?
Both.
First. Okay. Well, this is a little bit off the subject, but I see it as partly on the subject too. Yes, there's certainly a sexist element in a lot of religions, and it's a male sexist element in most religions. And there have been attempts to make the Bible gender neutral, and a lot of people have howled and screamed, because of the changing of the text of the Bible to make it gender neutral. I think this is a problem throughout society, as not necessarily just confined to religion. We have often the person who has the power, has the goal, makes the rules. You know what I mean? In other words, if you have the power, you make the rules, and if the rules are sexist or slanted in your direction, your gender, then that's the way they are because of that having the power. I'm not approving of this. I think I cannot confine it just to religion that does this, but it certainly does do it.
The answer is no.
What was the question?
Well, the question having to do with, I think, a kind of a left-handed slap at the Bible and Christianity in implication that it's chauvinistic in its tenets. And that's a false implication that's not true. Now, I think these questions like this are valid, but obviously they don't have to do with the existence or the non-existence of God. And if somebody wanted to debate that, these type of questions at a future time, I could do that. But I think the more problematic thing, if we're going to tie this back into the debate tonight, the more problematic thing for a person who takes the atheist position is that obviously the atheist mechanism for getting us here is evolution. But now, explain to me how, when you're dealing with males and females who are both constructed differently, who comes first? Which came first? One of them came first, didn't they? In terms of evolution, did not. One of them came first. They didn't both come together. How did they come? Who came first? But now, one of them came first without the other one. How did the other one get here? Without the first one. See what I'm saying? So if we tie this back down to the subject tonight, which had to do with atheism, I mean, a person can have their opinion about what the Bible might imply regarding the relationship between the sexes, but in terms of atheism, it has much wider implications, I think, that once again show the bankruptcy of the atheist position scientifically and logically.
The next question is for Dr. Stein, and this person writes, the Bible was written by over 30 authors on 5 continents over a period of time of 4,000 years. It gave 48 prophecies about one man that all came to be. Please explain that.
Well, I think I talked to this gentleman whose question this was during the break. I will give it for the general audience here. First, let me just make one statement, which really I shouldn't make, but I would suggest that Reverend Shelby ought to examine what evolution says, because you see this question about male and female is nonsense. It doesn't make any sense. It isn't a valid question even. But okay, let's go back to this. The point is that the 48 prophecies, what does it take for something to be a prophecy? It must be made before the event occurred. It must be clear and unambiguous, and it must have been fulfilled in the way that the event actually happened. Those are the 3 rules for prophecy, my rules, but they're rules that just any common sense person would say. There are almost no prophecies in the Bible that meet all 3 of those rules. We can definitely show that they were written before the event occurred. It's very easy to predict something after it happened. Simple. Number 2, it must be clear and unambiguous. A virgin shall conceive, from Isaiah. It has nothing to do with Mary. It has to do with the wife of King Ahaz, and it says it right in there. Look at the next sentence. So you can't just take an ambiguous thing and apply it to whatever you want. And 3, it must be fulfilled in the way it says. Now, I'll give you an example of a prophecy that's totally unfulfilled. And that is, it says in the book of Micah that the city of Damascus shall be destroyed. Damascus is still the capital of Syria. It's been in existence for thousands of years. It's never been destroyed. And it's written clearly as a prophecy. Now, if you want to say, oh, well, there's some prophecies that don't come true. Do they or don't they? Are they from God or not? I mean, you want to hold them up to the same criteria, let's hold it up. That was one that was made before the event happened. It's one that's clear and unambiguous, and it has never happened, never come true. But you explain it. I defy you to show me 43 predictions that meet all those 3 criteria. If they don't, they aren't predictions that are adequate.
I think, again, that would be the subject of another
Yes.
debate, which I would be glad to do. Now, since Dr. Stein harkened back for a previous question to make a comment, let me also inject one comment about the same thing. Not only does evolution not have a scientific explanation for where the sexes came from, but it's also got a much bigger problem in terms of the races. Because evolution, if it's true, is inherently racist, which is where you can get Adolf Hitler arguing for the supremacy of the Aryan race. So for the person that wants to say that the Bible is sexist, I disagree. But to say from an atheist position that evolution is not, or that it's not racist, you have to be consistent if that's what you're going to believe in. Now, I think that in terms of the question that was just asked, the problem is you can set up your the elements in your investigation to get the answer that you want, and that's what is done by those who say that the prophecies are invalid. Also, I would say regarding Damascus, that just as all I would say is God does not settle all of his accounts in 1996.
The next question is for Reverend Shelby. Do you believe that other beings can exist in other areas of the universe?
Yes, and they do. In terms of, if you're asking me a theological question, what does the Bible describe? The Bible describes other beings that exist in other areas of the universe, and it names them, and even describes some of their functions and interrelationships between each other and things that they do in terms of a hierarchy of spiritual beings and things like that. So the short answer is yes.
Are you talking about angels? Or are you talking about human beings?
Angels.
Well, that was the
question. Was the question human beings?
No, other beings.
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 If the question is that vaguely worded, that beings could be supernatural beings, then I think the answer is no. I don't think there are supernatural beings or angels anywhere in the universe. Now, if you're asking if living forms with intelligence that we might call, I don't know if you want to call them human beings, but intelligent life, I think you understand what I mean, flesh and blood life, exists elsewhere in the universe, I think almost definitely yes. There's no reason why another planet can't have the same conditions hospitable to life, and that evolution would have occurred there as well. And so, if we want to divide the question that way, I would say yes to one and no to the other.
The next question is addressed to both, and we'll let Reverend Shelby answer first. What's the proof that it's one and only one God? Certainly all the bad things in the universe, the pointless deaths caused by natural disasters, the birth defects, the diseases, etc., suggest botched work done by a committee of gods.
I like the way that's put. I'm trying to think of a way I can use that to apply to my staff meetings sometimes. I think, however, the same answer that I gave before on one of the other questions. You would never know what red was. You never would, because there's never anything to compare it against. Now, if there is one God, do you not think that in order to display His love, He has to allow evil? I mean, logically He does. Otherwise, it cannot be displayed. So, the fact that God allows these choices to be made is no negative implication on Him. It doesn't mean He created evil. But He allowed evil so that His love could be displayed and you would have choices. Now, I think Dr. Stein and all of us would agree that events have consequences, that actions have consequences. And the Bible speaks to that very clearly in terms of actions having consequences. And those consequences are just as you described in the question, that there is pain and there is suffering, and the natural order that we see now in that sense to some degree is botched. Now, there was no problem with the creating of it, but we know that something happened to inject the problems that we have now. And the simplest explanation, the simplest is always best, is that if there's one true God, in order to display who He is, He has to allow the opposite of His character to exist, and that person that displays the opposite of His character then counterfeits what He does, which related to the question we had a while ago, but then also brings in the other things. Don't blame God for pain and suffering. Blame the opposite of God, and blame also the actions and the choices that were made by individuals, because those choices and those actions had consequences, and all of that stands true to scientific law. The thing that you should be noticing is not that God allowed that to happen, but that God Himself took that burden upon Himself, became a man, put Himself under the subjection of the same innocent person suffering wrongly in order to take away and give you an opportunity for salvation and a plan, a method of salvation, a way for you to be redeemed out of it.
There's a Bible verse which I cannot identify by location, in which God says that He created evil. And if you don't believe me, look it up in your concordance. You'll see that it indeed says that God says He created evil as well as good. So his theology is a little faulty if he wants to go by the Bible. Number two, God is obviously allowing evil. If He's not allowing it, then it wouldn't happen. If He wanted to stop it, He's omnipotent, remember? He could easily stop it. So He is allowing it. To say that He's not allowing it is ridiculous. Of course He's allowing it. And this is a little bit of a problem with an all good God. And it goes to what I was saying about the model being so contradictory before. Now, this business about a committee making, like a botched committee making the things, I think that that's absolutely a very good observation. We certainly don't have a perfect world here. We have lots of disease, hunger, illness, all kinds of things like that. And I'll close with just a quotation from, illustrating this point from one of my favorite people, Robert G. Ingersoll, who said, if they asked him the question, the newspaper man asked him the question, what would you do to change the design of the world if you were God? He said, well, I'd make good health catching instead of disease. If you think about it, this is a brilliant statement. Because if the world were really cleverly designed, why shouldn't good health be something that spreads through the world like an epidemic? Why should disease be the thing that spreads? I mean, this is a terrible thing to have disease spread around, and it certainly flies in the face of an all good God, especially if innocent people are afflicted with this disease. It should have been designed so that good health caught and spread like a contagion.
All right, the next question is addressed to Dr. Stein. You said gravity was a natural law. Then please explain it naturally.
I didn't say it was a natural law. What I said is that laws, what we call laws, are statistical probability statements. We drop a ball over and over and over again millions of times. We drop an object millions of times, and we see that it always falls to the earth. And so we make a statement that the probabilities are that the next time we drop a ball, it will fall to the earth. And that's what a scientific law is. It's basically a probability statement, the probability being almost 100%, perhaps 100%, but I would say 99.9999%, that the next time a ball will drop. And we say that that is due to gravity. We don't explain gravity, at least not in just postulating that it exists, because we don't, in this particular case, know how gravity works. And I can't explain it. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist, that I can't explain it. In fact, science can't explain a lot of things yet. I'm hoping and confident that eventually it will be able to explain it. But, that doesn't preclude us from observing the effects of something. And that's all scientific law is an observation of the statistical likelihood that something will occur again that occurred in the past based on the past probabilities. So we have a law of gravity. That does not mean that we understand gravity, nor does it mean we understand a lot of things. We just give it a name and a use.
I think Dr. Stein takes the blind chance position on the universe, that all the seeming purpose or order can be explained simply in terms of natural laws without any other basis. Now, what you need to remember is that appealing to natural laws in this way only begs the question. For one thing, how can you have impersonal laws and yet have a very purposed order in the universe? How can you just have laws observing purpose and order in the universe and saying that laws just of themselves are self-justifying and self-validating? That is begging the question in this way. What Dr. Stein is really saying is that things exist with order because we have laws. Well, why do we have laws? Well, because I can observe things exist with order. I can observe it so many times, and I can predict then what it's going to do. Well, then why can you observe it? Well, because of laws. Well, why do we have laws? Well, because I can observe it. You see the nature of the circular reasoning in that, where really he has no explanation for how it could exist in an atheist worldview, where what you would predict is disorder and not having laws.
The next question is addressed to Reverend Shelby. If God wanted a world, when did He decide to create it? Upon His immediate existence, when He got lonely, how long did it take Him to postulate the question?
When He created it, in terms of the scientific evidence, was between 8 and 20 billion years ago. And I think probably the more correct one is closer to the lower one. But that's what the scientific evidence says. Now, I think the question has to do more with how long did He wait before He created it. And again, the problem with that question is that you are looking at God who stands outside and above our time-space continuum. there's no time with God. So there's no way to ask the question or answer the question logically if you're dealing with God according to the definition that Dr. Stein and I have both accepted. Because within that definition, God is someone who stands outside of, He's personal, He stands outside of the universe, He also created it. But you know, He created it before time started. It wasn't here until He created it, and then there was time. It was time at the moment that He started. So how long did He wait before He created it? That's one of those things that you can't get at, because you're running up against the definition of God when you do that. And if God is going to be God, then He's going to stand outside of all of that, and that question doesn't have the same meaning. You see what I'm saying? In other words, how long did God wait before He created the universe can't be answered, because there wasn't time with God. Because He stands outside of the time-space continuum and created the whole thing. Created time as well as matter. Now that's according to the God that the Bible presents. And that is logically consistent. That is scientifically consistent with what we observe now, because when we go back in terms of the observable evidence in the universe, and we take it back to its logical conclusion, you see that the universe had a beginning, and had a beginning from nothing. Another statement that I was going to read in connection with that, Sir Arthur Eddington made the statement, and Dr. Stein had criticized it. Some of the people I quoted from may have been astronomers back in the 20s and 30s. Actually, I quoted quite a few very recent people. But Arthur Eddington stated, "Religion first became possible for a reasonable man of science in the year 1927. I would say clearly Dr. Stein is behind the times, if he's a reasonable man, behind the scientific times, because it was in 1927 that they observed and recorded Hubble's law about the galaxies retreating from us in proportion to how far away they are, showing that if you take it back, there had to have been a beginning of the universe in space and time."
Of course, I accept the red shift idea of the Hubble thing. It has nothing to do with what we're talking about. Obviously, the universe is expanding. I'm not disputing that in the slightest. So that's all a red herring that he's raising, that I don't accept that. I do accept it. And Arthur Eddington, of course, was back in the 20s, just as I said. But anyway, the statement about God is outside of time and space continuum is an absolutely mind-boggling statement. Nothing can be outside of time and space and have any connection with human beings. If God is outside of time and space, then we cannot communicate with God. Either if you want us to communicate with God, then He has to be inside of time and space. Otherwise, if you think about it, what does it mean to be outside of time and space? It means to be completely outside the universe, outside of the physical and visible and logical concept of the universe. I can't explain it any other way. But I do agree with Reverend Shelby that if until the universe existed, there was no time. That doesn't make any sense to have a concept of time until the universe existed. But that's not the same thing as God being outside of time and space.
Okay, the next question is for both speakers, and Dr. Stein will answer first. Where would you go and spend eternity if you were to die tonight? Please explain.
Well, the question has no meaning to me, because I don't think you'd go anywhere. I mean, that's the answer. It's nowhere. Your body would disintegrate into chemicals in the earth or wherever it was, and your personality would disappear, and you would live on in the memory of other people. That's the real immortality. Write a book or invent something or have a family that remembers you. That's the only real immortality there is, which is not a bad kind of immortality. But the answer is nowhere.
I think this question is once again good to point out the bankruptcy of the atheist position, because what Dr. Stein is really saying is that he would go to the same place that he will not admit that God is able to exist at. In other words, remember when we were talking about God and my statement that He existed outside of the space-time continuum, and he said, well, how can you even conceive of that? Well, then how can you conceive of what happens after death? The answer is you can't, but yet you know that you die, something happens with you. You may not believe in a conscious existence. Maybe you say that you die like a dog and it just goes into nothing. But still, you're gone. Every person in this room tonight, there's a self-knowledge you have of yourself. And in your heart, what you're believing is that if anybody ought to live forever, it ought to be me. If anybody should live forever, I should. I mean, nobody's done it yet. And they didn't discover the Fountain of Youth down there in Florida like they thought they were going to. But if anybody should discover it, I should, and I should live forever. Why? Because you know in your heart and in your mind, there's that self-consciousness that you have of yourself that says, this wasn't for nothing. It can't just go off like, it can't be like a candle that you snuff out. There's some place that you go, there's something that goes on. That's why, by and large, people in the world are not atheists. It does not ring true with ourselves, not at all. And they will almost grasp anything to keep from that vacuum of believing nothing. But yet, there is some place that you go that you know in yourself that it's not just cut off. If anybody should live forever, you should. And that's not just wishful thinking. You know that from inside of yourself. And the answer for me, I can give unequivocally, because again, it's based not on wishful thinking, but on what the Bible says about what happens after death, and based on the sacrifice of Jesus Christ and His blood shed for my sins, I would go to be with God in His presence.
Okay, the next question is addressed to Dr. Stein. What will you do if and when you stand before a God that requires an answer for your rejection of His existence truth?
Well, if that ever were to happen, and I think the chances are almost zero of it happening, but if it were to happen, I would admit I was wrong. And I would say, as Bertrand Russell said, when asked exactly that question, he said, you didn't give us enough evidence. And that's exactly what I would say. You didn't give human beings enough evidence that was logically valid and supportable that you existed. And if you wanted to, it would be real easy to do so. All you do is put an appearance somewhere, and once in a while, that would be all it would take. If God wanted you to believe in Him 100%, wanted every person to believe in Him fully, all you have to do is put in an appearance in a few places and show that He's around. You're certainly not doing that. And if you think you have a pipeline to God, I can recommend a good place for you to go, get some help. But, no, I'm serious. I don't mean it that nasty way, but I'm saying in order for you to have evidence that God speaks to you, it has to be demonstrable in more ways than just that you hear it in your head. And you have to show other people that there are voices going on there and what it's saying, and that's real hard to do. It's more of a personal experience, one-on-one. And if it is, if it has no validation as being true other than hallucinatory, I'm saying you can't distinguish it from hallucination unless you can demonstrate it to someone other than yourself hearing it in your head. Now, I'm not saying you can't do that. I mean, you should be able to. If it really is a true voice you're hearing, there should be some way of recording that or showing other people what that content is of that. And if you can't, then it's still indistinguishable from a hallucination. And, I don't know if that adds any evidence to the existence of God. I do want to add one thing. It does take strength of character to be an atheist, and not everyone can be one. And if you can't be, and don't feel you can be, that's fine. But if you do feel you have the strength of character and a reality-based desire, then maybe you're going to try it.
I would not say it takes strength of character to be an atheist. When I read Bertrand Russell's statement that that's what he would say when he appeared before God, I did not think that was a statement of strength of character. I thought it was rather absurd. Very absurd, because tonight we've given you evidence. We've given you more evidence than you can write down and digest in one evening. So to stand before God and to say, well, you didn't give me enough evidence, you will have to explain how in your lifetime NASA spent $60 million searching for extraterrestrial intelligence, and they knew what they were looking for because they're looking for an encoded message which nature by random laws cannot duplicate, which nature cannot duplicate by chance. And in your lifetime they were looking for that, and yet you sat here tonight and you heard all these things about DNA and protein and just the carbon-12 having the right harmonic resonance and all these other things, and you still sat here and chose to disbelieve it. I think that you'll have to explain a lot more than that to God.
The next question is for Reverend Shelby. Given the vast number of holy books and the vast number of gods portrayed, how do you pick one?
The way that you pick one, and again, I've made this statement before, just because there's a multiplicity of religions or religious writings doesn't mean that there's not one correct one, and secondly, it does not mean that you cannot find it. So you do need to search for something that is logically coherent. And this is where all of the other major religions fail. They are incoherent logically within themselves, because just like the problem you have with the eternally rebounding Big Bang Theory, it's a static universe that is not supported by the evidence scientifically. And even when you get behind it, it has to start someplace. To say it was always there forever, just to say it was always there forever, and just to say that, and just to make that statement when there's nothing else you can point to, there's no law in the universe, you'd say, well, you know, this is how we know this. Just to make that statement is faith in the worst sense of the word, which is exactly the definition that Dr. Stein. You notice how our definitions of faith totally disagreed tonight. And yet he accepts in his own life something by that same definition, which is that the universe just always was. And I don't have to say why it always was. I don't have to it was just always there. All the other major religions either take that position, like Buddhism, which I mentioned, Shintoism, Taoism, religions like that have the continuous reincarnation, or have God being nirvana or karma or something impersonal. Here's the problem. It's logically inconsistent. You've got an ordered, purposeful universe. And yet you're not going to have an ordered, purposeful God. You're going to say that you have more personality than you're going to allow God to have. And it doesn't make sense. Or on the other hand, you've got other religious writings that again have logical inconsistencies in them. And I know that Dr. Stein and others of you in here would say, well, I believe I found those in the Bible. Well, let's have another debate sometime.
Okay, of course it's correct that the fact that there's a multiplicity of religions doesn't mean that one isn't correct. It also doesn't mean that one is correct. It could all be wrong. You could have, in fact, I've heard the definition of an atheist. When a famous atheist was asked what is the difference between you and a theist, he said the theist believes that 99 out of the 100 gods that are postulated are false. I just believe that one more is false, all 100. So I mean, you know, you are indeed. It's quite just as possible that 100 are all wrong, 100 religions are all wrong, as it is that 99 are wrong and one is right. In fact, it's probably more reasonable to believe that they're all wrong. Here's the problem with what Reverend Shelby said. God is always there, always has been there, he's eternal. Okay? Now he's violating his own thing that every cause must have an effect. Every effect must have a cause. If every effect must have a cause, then there's no such thing as an eternal thing, if that's the case. Now, if God is the exception, well, you know, as I said, the universe could be an exception too. I don't have any faith that the universe is eternal. I just say that this is an explanation which is logically consistent with the evidence, much of the evidence, and could be correct. I don't believe it's so in the sense that I'm willing to say it's a fact. It isn't a fact. It's just a hypothesis or a theory, possibly tested hypothesis, that explains things without the need for there to be a God and makes sense out of the world. It doesn't mean it's true. It doesn't mean I believe that it's true. I just happen to think that it's quite possible that it might be true.
The next question is addressed to both speakers, and Reverend Shelby will answer first. At what point in your life did you either accept, or reject, or suppress, or believe in the knowledge of God and become an atheist or a Christian? And why did you do this? Because you feel your atheistic or religious theory was correct, or was it simply convenient?
I think that every person grows up knowing from, again, as I mentioned before, that self-knowledge in themselves that there is a God and that there's someone higher than them, and they pretty much have to be educated out of it. Or come to a point in their life where, as I mentioned before, they want to be able to admit an order and a validity to science and to logic, but not to morals. And so they have to have a place to hide. And so they'll hide out in agnosticism or in atheism. It was when I was 11 years old that, I think we all reach that age in our life where we know right from wrong. We begin to learn right from wrong, and immediately we're faced with a choice. Since we know innately, not from consensus, not from sociology, not even from our parents, but we know innately certain things were wrong for us to do, certain things were right. We have a conscience, and that conscience has a function within us, and we know that, and we do things that we know are wrong by anybody's definition. And we start to say, there are some problems with this. God starts dealing with us on that. And for me, it was at that age. And I think the most striking thing to me is that probably that was about the first time in my life I ever attended a funeral. And it hit me at that moment that one day it would be me in that casket. What does that mean? And then to hear the truth of the gospel and compare it logically and rationally and reasonably and look at it scientifically and see how it all lines up, it had the ring of truth, and I knew the truth then when I heard it.
Dr. Stein? Well, I grew up in a Unitarian family, and we basically had very little dogma, and I didn't really have an opinion about the existence of God or any real conclusion that I reached until I got to graduate school. And then I sort of went through a period when I decided I was going to straighten out my beliefs on religion once and for all by examining all the evidence in as objective a way as I could. I read a lot of Christian apologetics, and I read philosophers, I read atheist literature. I just tried to look at all the arguments of the existence of God that had been offered. And I came out with the conclusion not to prove it, basically, that there was no conclusive evidence that proved to me that there was a God. And so I remain open to any proofs that anyone can offer that I haven't seen yet. It's been a long time since I've heard a new one, but I'm sure someone will come up with a new one that I haven't seen. But I do read the literature religiously, if you want to call it that, and I still haven't seen any good ones. There's an argument we haven't even gotten into here about, for example, Alvin Plantinga says that basically God is a thing that's so basic that it doesn't need any proof. Well, I can say atheism is something that's so obvious and the evidence is all around you that there's no God. If you want to look at it that way, I haven't seen the evidence for it. So, that's maybe a basic thing that doesn't need any proof. So, this is a stupid argument is what I'm getting at. And yet, philosophers have actually, theologians have rallied to him, to his position, and said, hey, that's a great new argument. It's a lousy argument. It just begs the question. It says we don't need any proof because we can't come up with any. So we won't offer any. We don't need any. Anyway, that's the answer to when I became an atheist.
The next question is for Dr. Stein. You disputed faith without seeing because of, quote, a lack of evidence. However, you said you could not see a black hole but believed the black holes exist because of the evidence. Please explain.
Well, the evidence is not seeing the black holes. You have to distinguish between physically observing the black hole, which we can't do, but we can see what happens to light and how it's sucked into this area and disappears. It never comes out again. We can see other things that are behave in a way that indicates they've been sucked into some kind of an abyss, if you want to call it that, from which there is no exit. And that conforms to the mathematical model of a black hole. So even though we can't see the black hole, we see the evidence of things being affected by the black hole, which is secondhand evidence, but it's pretty good considering how far away it is.
I think the things that Dr. Stein was saying are really the proof of my position in terms of why there's a God. And with the black hole, no light can escape the event horizon of the black hole, right? The infinite gravity such that all of it is sucked in. That means you're never going to observe physically a black hole. You can't, because light can't escape it, so you just can't see it. But what you can see in the universe are things that are unexplainable without a black hole, right? You can see other light, then you can, gravitational properties and all that, again, gets into quantum mechanics and Einstein's equations and things like that. But you can see things that say, well, the only thing that could cause that would be a black hole, which has exactly been the thesis of my argument, and the basis of my argument tonight was giving you all of the evidence. Since you can't look at God face to face because God is a spirit, all of the evidence, so you can say, the only explanation, there's no explanation for that outside of God, there's God.
The next question is directed to Reverend Shelby. If God is a perfect being, why wouldn't the universe be perfect? Why, even though we don't lose energy, would it dissipate if God is perfect?
The answer is that some things that God created initially were created perfect. That doesn't mean that they have to be perfect today. So the fact that they're not perfect today does not mean that God is not perfect. It means He simply allowed them to come into an imperfect state. But again, we're back to the question back to the issue that if everything were red, you would lose the definition of what red is. God is perfect. And for Him to allow imperfection in the same way for Him to allow evil is simply a way for you to discover who He is. And again, the question is not, well, why did God allow imperfection? The issue tonight for you personally is the fact that God offers you escape from the imperfection. God has made a plan to get you out of the imperfection. God has offered the good news of the gospel that gets you into an ultimate state of perfection. And, all of this, it makes no sense to you. And you say, well, it's not logically consistent, it can't be done, because again, we're back to the thing that if everything must have a cause, then God must have a cause. But now hold it. Every cause must have an effect. God only needs a cause if He is an effect. He's not an effect. God is not an effect, therefore, He does not need a cause, because that's part of the basic definition of God. It's like trying to observe a black hole. It's like saying that, well, I won't believe in black holes until I see one. Well, you'll never see one. But you can still observe the pointers that point to Him. And the really remarkable thing is that even in spite of all the imperfection that you can point out in the universe, in the world, in your life maybe, all of the disorder and disorganization and other things, you know that everything that is ordered in your life is ordered because there was an intelligence that went in there. Whether it is your room, your locker, your notebooks, the way you approach this semester, the way you approach your studies, or anything else, if it has order, it's because there was an intelligence which went in and ordered it. And yes, there is an imperfect universe out there that allows you to see who God is. But the really amazing thing is that despite the fact that there's an imperfect universe out there, there's enough perfection that you can be assured that you can measure the details down to the point that you know that there's no other explanation for the beginning of things outside of God. Scientifically, you can measure it down to where you have to say that there still had to be a beginning to things, and despite the imperfection, I can measure that closely that I know that it could not exist without a creator.
Well, if God is perfect, as Reverend Shelby said, and He created the universe in a perfect way, and now it is somehow not perfect, then this touches on what's called the ontological argument, which I'm not going to get into, but I'm going to tell you in just in brief that a perfect being cannot allow things that He created to become imperfect, or He, the perfect being, is not perfect anymore. He has shown a flaw, or a lapse, or a gap, or a limitation, if you want to call it that, and that is to allow imperfection in His own creation. This is a complicated argument, but basically, I think, logically it makes sense that if you were going to say that God is perfect, and His creation is perfect, because only a perfect creation can be made by a perfect being, then for Him to allow it to become imperfect means that He's not perfect, because He's now flawed, He's now limited, He's now not allowing perfection to occur. To say that God is not in effect is just as meaningful a statement as to say the universe is not in effect. If you want to call it that, if the universe is eternal, if God is eternal and therefore it's not in effect, God is not in effect, then the universe is not in effect. So that doesn't help any. I mean, we're both back to the same point of either God or the universe is eternal. And we know the universe exists. We don't know whether God exists. So I think the universe is a better guess if we want to take a better choice if we want to take one or the other.
The next question is addressed to both speakers and will be answered first by Dr. Stein. And let me sort of preface it. It's based upon my hearing of the debate. Reverend Shelby, you've argued that the ordered nature of the universe is evidence for the existence of God. And Dr. Stein has argued that it would be greater proof for the existence of God for strange things that were unpredictable to happen in the universe. And so this person asks to both, are either of you familiar with chaos theory, which postulates that chaotic systems, when viewed on a grand scale, exhibit complex patterns? Please address.
Yes, I'm somewhat familiar with chaos theory. I'm no expert on it. I think it's just another attempt to, how do we explain this, to inject irrationality into the rational. By that I mean, why bother? Things are not chaotic on a subatomic level. They are maybe unpredictable. It's different from chaotic. Particles behave in a uniform kind of way. And that's how we can identify, when an atom breaks up, we can identify the various subparticles, subatomic particles, by the way they behave. Now, why can we do that? Because they behave in a consistent way. A meson behaves in a certain way, makes a certain kind of pattern, is attracted or not attracted in a certain way, it's a certain size, and certain things. I mean, these are maybe constructs that human beings use, and they may not represent absolute reality, but nevertheless, they have a predictable pattern, and that pattern is a kind of a uniform thing. So why say that there's chaos? To me, the word chaos is a loaded word. It implies absolute randomness and absolute non-predictability, and I don't think that's the case at all. Now, it could be that certain systems that look like they're chaotic on a micro level, on a macro level, they exhibit some kind of apparent order. But why postulate that when it isn't the case? It doesn't seem to be necessary.
Reverend Joe.
Chaotic systems show grander patterns. Okay, let's apply that maybe to answer the previous question that we had and we were dealing with. Because I don't think that's a totally invalid concept. But now we've got to settle something else first. Either God is eternal or the universe is eternal. Which is it? Well, we know that the universe is not eternal. That is not a scientific statement. We've showed you that tonight. Not only astrophysicists from the 20s and 30s, but modern physicists from today, the universe is an effect. They know it is an effect of something caused it. They know it's an effect. They know it's not eternal. Even if you have many big bangs, you don't have more than 100 of them. You just, from the laws, the things we can measure, we know there's how much of it's out there. We can get back to the root of it. The universe is an effect. The universe is not eternal. And that you can define God however you want to. But if the universe is an effect, something caused it. God caused it. God is not an effect. That's just part of the definition. But now, after we've got that, the question comes, but then if He's a perfect God, if He either creates or allows imperfection, then He must not be perfect. Well, but now hold it. You've totally taken the time factor out of it. What if God, in order to prove He is God, just like we talked about, if everything's red, you lose the meaning of the color red. If God, in order to prove He is God, creates a time-space continuum where choices can be made, and therefore imperfection can be made, and therefore evil can exist, if God creates a time-space continuum where that happens, and then makes a way out of it, in other words, through the chaos, if there's a grander pattern at the end, is He not still God, even though imperfection exists in the universe? The answer is yes, He is.
The next question is for Dr. Stein. Have you ever seen, felt, heard, smelled your own consciousness? If not, how do you know you have one?
Well, this goes back to the old question about the hum and the motor, as I said before. Consciousness is, again, the sign the brain is working. And it's like the hum and the motor, which you can't find anywhere by taking the motor apart, but it's still there. How do I know that consciousness occurs? All I have is my own perception of it. My sense organs, if you want to call them that, tell me that I'm perceiving something. And when I become unconscious, I'm not perceiving something. So all I have is my own self-verification system of my senses to tell me that. Now, it could very well be that my senses are fooling me, that I really have no consciousness. But, I would entertain evidence of that if you want to offer any. It seems to me the evidence runs the opposite direction, because we both agree that we both see something in a particular place and then we don't see it or hear it. It seems to be consensus among human consciousnesses of different people that something is being perceived by both of us. So there's some cross-validation that way. Since we seem to be opening the game up to previous questions, I want to say one other thing about a previous question here. Is the statement that God is eternal a scientific statement? Absolutely not. So, you're not making a scientific statement either, if you want to call the statement that the universe is eternal a scientific statement. Mine is a lot more scientific than yours is. Yours is certainly not scientific. And again, the explanation that God caused the universe is not an explanation. It's just putting a name on the statement, on the process. It doesn't explain how God created the universe. And therefore, it is not an explanation because it doesn't explain it. So he has not only has he not given us an explanation, he has hidden the fact by claiming that he's giving us an explanation when he blatantly has not given us an explanation. Just put a term on it. God did it. How did he do it? That's the explanation.
Well, I would say in terms of how he did it, I gave you tonight in spades how he did it. So the function, the mechanism has been very clearly described. And to say God's eternal is very scientific because we know that the universe is not. And yet it has to have an explanation for an existence. It has to have a creator for it. And, again, it gets back to how you want to define your God. How big do you want to make your God? As far as what you want to believe in. But what I think the person's question was getting to was that if you know you have a consciousness and a conscious existence, but you don't know that, in other words, you know you have a mind, but you don't know that because you've ever smelt it, saw it, tasted it, looked at it. You don't use sensory experience, and yet you know that there is something that exists there, a soul, apart from being able to put it in a test tube. Now, since we know that it exists, and what Dr. Stein is saying, and I can't tell how we know it exists, I just know it's there because I know it's there, then I think probably the question writer's point is the same thing is true of God.
The next question is for the Reverend Shelby, and actually a lot of people might have wanted this question answered before the Cowboys beat up on the Steelers last weekend. But how would you explain the process of prayer in the example of sports teams? Meaning, if both teams pray to God, how does he choose a winner? I'd say presumptions for the Cowboys, but...
Now that is a courageous and brave statement, because we don't know who the Steelers fans are in this room. So I think that's a good question upon which some discretion probably is advised. But it's a good question in terms of prayer to God because, the Bible defines very clearly a God who stands outside of the universe. God is spirit, and yet he has his mechanisms to plug into that universe in terms of a socket to plug into to have interaction with us. And does God use natural means to make that interaction? That's fine. I don't care if you want to say that in terms of the miracles of the Bible that there's a natural explanation for every one. God may very well have used natural means at his disposal to accomplish whatever he wanted to do. But that does not mean that God does not hear your prayer or cannot hear your prayer, or this fatalism that was defined tonight. That's not my position. I do not take that position of fatalism with regard to what the Bible teaches about God, because it's not that way. God, because he is who he is, and because he can make a rock so big that he can't move it, and because he is the only one that can make a square round, God is able to plug into your life in such a way that by his foreknowledge he knows what's going to happen, and at the same time you have the freedom to make choices. You also have the ability to pray and to see Him work, and Him to give you an answer, either yes, no, or wait, to anything that you might say to Him. And you have, once you accept His propositions, you have the power to inject Him into your universe and inject Him into your life and see Him work on your behalf. And you know this is true not only because He works out here in the realm that you can see physically, but you know it's true with an inner witness inside yourself. And now you finally got one unifying philosophy for everything that you see in the universe. So it's a good question. I cannot speak to whether God was on the side of the Cowboys more than the Steelers, but since the Cowboys won, I guess, what can you say? Although, again, like we said before, it doesn't mean that maybe let the Steelers, the Cowboys win this year because next year they're going to lose real bad or something. But I think that's a funny and a humorous way to ask a more serious topic.
The question about God and the Super Bowl is really a very simple one. I have inside information that God is actually from Dallas. That explains what happened. Now, no, I'm just going to say that was. But the point is, I want to raise one issue about this. Can God make a rock so big He can't move it? Reverend Schulte is clearly wrong about this because we know from logic that a logically self-contradictory thing cannot be true. It cannot be done. It cannot exist. You can't have a square circle. It's either square or it's a circle. The two concepts are contradictory to each other. So the statement, can God make a rock so big He can't move it, leads us to a logical self-contradiction. There's no such thing for an omnipotent person to be able to create something that he can't move, because then he would not be omnipotent. And, the whole thing is self-contradiction. So the answer is clearly neither God nor anyone else can make a rock bigger than he can move. So the opposite answer logically is true to what he said.
All right, the next question, I think we'll make it our final question, is addressed to both speakers. But again, both speakers have agreed to stay around for a few minutes if you want to come up and speak to them personally. And again, we'd like to thank you for attending. You've been a marvelous audience, and we'd like to thank you. The final question, and we'll begin with Reverend Shelby. What happened to the body of the historical figure Jesus of Nazareth following His crucifixion and burial?
It was resurrected after 3 days. That's the short answer.
But what happened to the body, though?
The body. What happened to the body?
I went to sit on the right hand of God. So that's the short answer. Now, I think in terms of, obviously, you set out there to say, well, resurrection has never happened in my experience. Again, it's another one of those things that you cannot prove scientifically. It's not repeatable. It's not like a law. It's not something that we've seen. We cannot give evidence to it. That's somebody's opinion. It was written a long time ago. It was probably changed by myriad number of scholars, and how can we really trust in it, and da-da-da-da-da-da. Well, bottom line is you're going to have to trust in something, because it's here with no other explanation than God, and there's no scientific one that's given for how it came about. So I think among the explanations that an atheist would normally accept for the existence of God, one of them would be if he put it in appearance, and he has put in an appearance. And so some of the things that we've said tonight are not logically self-contradictory. They are supralogical. And I think Dr. Stein hopes you don't know that much about logic, so that you're not going to check this out. But even within the realms of logic that are discussed in your classrooms here at KU, they will talk about supralogical things, or things that are true but exist outside of the realm of logic. And if you don't allow your definition of God and your God to have that same option, then you have simply set up your experiment ahead of time to get the results that you wanted in the end.
Well, what I said, to Reverend Shelby, is just quoting what I said that one thing that would convince me is that God put in an appearance here in front of me, not 2,000 years ago when I wasn't there. So that's an entirely different thing. I don't know whether He put in an appearance then. I don't know whether Jesus ever existed. All I know is that outside of the New Testament, there is zero zero evidence that Jesus ever existed. That doesn't mean that there isn't evidence in the New Testament. Of course there is. The question is, how good is the New Testament as a historical document? This is another debate entirely, of course, but I'll just, since I have 2 minutes here, I'm just going to say that the New Testament is not what a historian would call a primary source document. We do not have any copies of the New Testament from before 350 AD, real chunks of it, the little tiny pieces of, this big, but a little bit earlier version. But that would be like getting our Revolutionary War history from a 1950s book. Did the Revolutionary War occur in 1776 or not? I mean, sure, I think it did. But we have primary source documents dating from that period. If we had only stuff dating from the 1950s and nothing before that, we would begin to scratch our heads and say, how do we know that that really happened then? I'm talking about any evidence whatsoever. There isn't. So, if you want to accept the New Testament as historical evidence, go right ahead. Most historians would not accept it as primary source evidence. And the fact that there's no supporting evidence outside the New Testament makes me wonder whether this appearance really occurred or not.
And with that, we conclude tonight's debate.